Salvage, a story by user Rantarian. Chapter 60, Red Line Run. The human was riding the Vulza. 13 had spent valuable time coming to terms with that fact. On the face of it, it was an absurd idea, one that even the most foolhardy of trainers would never have attempted, and yet the human was parading himself around as if he belonged there. It was an insult to the evolution of the Vulza, as well as to the man-hours spent turning nature's greatest predator into a true combat machine. When he had first detected it on the internal sensors, 13 had not truly understood what was occurring. The human and the Kortai had started moving again, much as he'd expected, but the Vulza had not only been allowed to live, but it was moving with them. Their path had even straightened out from the meandering path that they'd been taking before, and now it was heading directly towards him. The sensors could tell him that much, but they couldn't tell him how or why. That was enough of a curiosity for him to take time away from the details of his other arrangements, to send yet another useless sentry bot against them. And this time 13 had been sure to inhabit the hapless robot so that he could see for himself. And what he had seen was the complete farce that was being made of his prize beast. Not that the beast seemed to belong to him anymore. Someone, almost certainly the Kortai, had fully suborned its control unit, and was now blocking out all other access. No matter what 13 tried, he had no ability to reclaim control of the monster, and when he had finally accepted that, he had put the sentry bot to good use. The sentry bot had only managed to fire a single shot before the Vulza was on it, and before all communication with the robot came to an end, but 13 saw enough to be certain that the kinetic pulse had at least imparted a glancing blow to the Kortai that had caused him so much trouble. The internal sensors revealed him to still be alive, but they said nothing about the quality of his health, and after a shot like that, he had to at least be in a serious amount of pain. For the time being, that would have to be enough, and perhaps it might even be preferable. It wasn't as though any of them were going to escape, not now that 13 had activated the emergency option. There was no getting out of this one, and all 13 had to do was wait and enjoy the ride. Their journey would be over soon. Forever. Adrian carried the injured Kortai in his arms, resting him gently over the back of the Vulza as it marched them towards the motherfucker who'd done this to him. He was furious at 13, but also at himself. He had allowed himself to grow complacent with the sentry bots only targeting him, and Asket had paid the price. That price, from what he could tell, was a broken arm, and possibly some cracked ribs to go with it. But at least his suit remained intact as far as Adrian could tell. No matter what happened, the little Kortai wouldn't have to be worried about sudden decompressions.
"Don't worry, mate,"
Adrian reassured the Kortai hacker.
"I won't let any of those fuckers get you again. And you can bet I'm going to sort this fuckstick out."
He had everything he needed to do just that, including Betty, the friendly missile of promises needing to be kept, which was currently tethered to the space dragon's tail. It must have been bizarre to see their procession, but if there were any more sentries left to witness it, they didn't approach. Asket, for his part in it, seemed remarkably upbeat about the deteriorated state of his health, although perhaps that was just shock, and didn't do anything stupid like asking Adrian to leave him behind. That might have had something to do with him being a Kortai, but Adrian preferred to think of it as Asket predicting the response where he'd be told to get fucked if he thought that was happening. The space dragon didn't waste any time in getting them to where they needed to go, and the wide doors to the command deck opened to accept the whole of the beast. There, amongst the beeping consoles and one really weird-looking chair, stood the smuggest motherfucker Adrian had seen in a very long time.
"There's no fucking way you're not 13,
he observed, his eyes sweeping over the rest of the weird alien biped. 13 was probably the tallest alien Adrian had ever had the misfortune to meet, taller even than the blue giraffes, and it wore clothes, actual proper clothes, to cover and adorn its slender body. Its face, however, looked like a child's drawing, with big, widely set eyes, large, pointy ears, and no fucking nose to be seen anywhere. Asket turned his head with a grunt of pain so that he could see. "It's a Kinnis. They're with the Kelsi Alliance."
"He's missing his nose,"
Adrian replied, fixated on the fact.
"How does he smell?"
Asket turned his attention back to Adrian. I'm sure he has some sort of olfactories.
Terrible, mate.
Adrian interrupted with a sigh, knowing that it was moments like this where he missed having another human around. There would have been no way that Jen would have missed a joke like that.
He smells terrible.
Smiling faintly, Askett patted him on the head. Very amusing. Adrian pointed his gun at the creature, who stared at it with some mixture of fear and firm resolve. You are correct, it said. I am 13. I assume that is the missile you wish to lodge into my anus. And may I say, it's very impressive that you've managed to take control of my... Adrian shot him in the left leg. It exploded. 13 didn't seem to enjoy it much, because he began screaming in agony before he'd even finished hitting the deck. His leg was gone from below the knee, if the creature had a knee, and he now seemed far too wrapped up in his own issues for Adrian's liking. Sliding carefully from the back of the Vulza, Adrian took care with Askett to avoid hurting him any further, and set him down in one of the comfortable chairs, where he could watch the exchange that was about to happen, and made sure that it was far enough away from the Vulza that if something were going to go wrong with Askett's control of the beast, he wouldn't become a Cortai-sized snack.
That was for my mate over there,
Adrian told the wailing alien as he stepped closer to it.
Now you're going to tell me everything I want to know.
That seemed to bring 13 out of his anguish for a moment, because the alien stared at him with naked hatred. I'm not going to... Adrian stopped pressing down on the stump of 13's left leg once he felt his point was made.
As I was saying, you're going to tell me everything.
You're a monster, 13 accused, staring up at him with wide eyes. Worse than I could have imagined. The alien recoiled from Adrian's hard stare.
Maybe,
he grated.
But then I'm not the freak with one leg.
Adrian pressed his foot down once again. It seemed this alien was a slow learner. Normally torture wasn't something that Askett liked, because it always seemed as though it was so messy. 13 was an exception, since Askett didn't much appreciate being shot, but he still found Adrian's methodology to be somewhat chilling. This almost seemed like the sort of thing that he had done before. There's nothing you can do, 13 told Adrian, his tone begging, pleading for some form of mercy. It's all lucked out. Even I can't get in. 13 had become extremely cooperative after his first few lessons in proper manners, and had let them know all about the fact that they were being shot into a singularity. This, Askett realized, was the hierarchy's version of the self-destruct system Adrian had been talking about earlier. And it was every bit as terrifying.
What do you know about black holes, Askett?
Adrian asked, turning away from the weeping 13 for the time being.
Is it as bad as I think it is?
It's worse than you think it is, Askett replied, interpreting the strange phrase to mean what it was intended to. He'd already been looking up the details that 13 had told them, and none of it looked good. Gravity wells like that, or intense gravity waves like the ones used in hunter traps, they'll break down the warp fields of any vessel in FTL.
Won't that destroy the ship?
Adrian queried.
I've almost had that happen before.
Askett leveled a stare at him. Of course he'd almost had it happen before. The human was a walking disaster zone, and yet, somehow, safer to be around than not, proving that sometimes you just had to take the good with the bad.
It was aboard the Zardasil,
Adrian added, and that was all the explanation that Askett needed or was going to get. From what he could tell from Adrian's stories about the ship, it was a decrepit piece of crap that had been decommissioned by the people who built it aeons ago, and Adrian had repeatedly fouled up by trying to put it back together. It was a wonder it had ever been working as much as it had. External stimuli will dissolve a field safely, Askett explained, giving the human a basic education any other spacefarer would already have received. Only a system's failure will result in the kind of patchy breakup that nearly killed you. Adrian turned back to 13, who was busy taking shallow breaths and staring vacantly at the ceiling.
Let me guess. Pay attention.
He pressed down on the stump again, getting 13's full and undivided attention along with a lingering yowl of agony.
We don't get kinetic drives either.
Only Only the FTL is locked, 13 replied, his voice wavering from the pain. You'll have the kinetics when we leave warp, but it won't have the power to get you free. Adrian looked towards the exit that led to the life pod reserved for command deck personnel.
I'm guessing we can't use the life pod either.
Locked, 13 confirmed, some gloating returning to his voice before it was again pressed out of him.
Then we've got no way out,
Adrian replied, once he was satisfied that 13 wasn't gloating anymore. Then he turned to Askett.
We can't try a slingshot, can we?
Imagine I don't know what that is, Askett replied weakly. And then imagine I'd just been shot.
Right, sorry,
Adrian apologized.
I mean, I know this from things, entertainment things, but can't we turn enough to swing around it? If we keep accelerating, it might help us get out.
Askett considered this, not seeing anything obviously wrong with Adrian's plan except for the fact that it may simply not work. That way could certainly build up a lot more speed and momentum to get them free, rather than the usual tried and failed method of turning around to go back the other way. It might work, he agreed, but I'd need access to the ship computers. Adrian turned back to 13, who was by now staring at the pair of them in some sort of vacant terror. Shock had clearly set in, although his leg had surprisingly stopped bleeding. He wasn't any kind of doctor, but Askett wondered whether this was the result of some sort of miracle drug, or if it had simply been cauterized by crushing.
You're going to give us full access to everything,
Adrian told him flatly. 13 shrank back from him, pressing himself against the floor as much as he could. I can't! The things they do to me!
The things I'll do if you don't, Adrian replied. Remember, you've still got another leg.
Torturing 13 had been unpleasant. Not in the matter of causing the creature pain, he certainly deserved it, but he had not even hesitated to do it, and that raised all sorts of very personal questions that Adrian did his best not to think about. It was the sort of thing that had nasty associations with Cameron White, and of course, the other time. At least it had paid off. Askett had taken control of the ship away from the hierarchy agent, and was busy running simulations on slingshot trajectories. Since he had nothing better to do, Adrian ensured that 13 was properly contained, and then contented himself with watching the small Cortai grow increasingly frustrated. This isn't going to work, he finally said, looking up to meet Adrian's watchful gaze. The projections that are promising for us, even withstanding the tidal forces, won't get us free, and the ones that will get us free will destroy us.
Maybe there's a happy medium?
Adrian suggested. He wasn't willing to give up before they'd even tried, whether simulations labeled something impossible or not. There is no happy medium, Askett snapped irritably. Adrian remained silent. It was clear that the pain and frustration and fear of being crushed into a sprinkle of matter were all getting to him.
All right, mate,
Adrian said calmly.
But maybe put all that on the main screen so you can explain it?
Askett glared at him, but relented immediately. Fine. The picture that appeared on the main screen was simplistic in the extreme. A dark blue screen with a black-filled circle in its center, with a trio of more colorful curved lines set to either side of it. The red line, Askett explained, pointing to the middle circle, shows the minimum distance the ship can survive. Any closer, and we die. No exceptions. Adrian looked at that line, and saw that it seemed to come fairly close to the black hole. The yellow line was closer still, which wasn't helpful no matter what it meant, but the cheerfully green line that was furthest out by far seemed promising.
What's the green one?
He asked, pointing to it.
Green is normally good, right?
The green line shows the maximum distance we can put between us and the black hole, given our projected warp exit point, Askett explained. And the yellow? That's where we can get enough speed to actually escape.
So what do we need?
Adrian asked.
Less weight? More go?
Weight isn't an issue so long as we've got the momentum, Askett replied. I varied the mass around in case you wanted to try blasting off parts of the hull. It seems that a higher mass yields a better result.
I guess Peg-Leg Pete over there gets to stick around then,
Adrian said grudgingly.
Could we push the drive beyond its normal limits?
Asket shook his head. Anything beyond its tolerances will cause damage, and the amount of extra power you'd need for this would burn it out within moments. It had been intended as a joke, but Asket didn't laugh. Instead, he looked back at his calculations with a thoughtful frown. That is a potentially helpful idea. Adrian was puzzled for a few moments, not understanding what the Cortai could mean by that. Then he realized.
The missiles.
Asket immediately grew wide-eyed in horror. The missiles? I was only thinking about the robots. They have small kinetic drives, but they should give us a small boost.
Why not the missiles as well?
Adrian asked.
They should give a lot more of a push.
Asket blinked. Because missiles explode?
Only if you arm them,
Adrian replied.
And from the looks of it, we need all the fucking help we can get.
Once they'd agreed upon the most insane plan of all time, Adrian had made the trip down to the reactor and kinetic drive to make them unsafe, leaving Asket to determine just how unsafe it would get. There'd been a lot of things to consider, such as how many missiles there were, and where they'd best be placed to push the ship along without breaking it in the process. Ultimately, it proved that the room they were stored in was the best candidate, having the thickest walls inside the ship with more structural reinforcement than was strictly required. That simplified things, and given the overall complexity of the rest of the mad scheme, a little simplicity was a great comfort. The final numbers came back just before Adrian re-entered the room.
Still going?
He asked, taking a seat. He was out of breath, and must only have just finished preparing the engines for an act of desperation. Asket looked up at him, cautious against appearing too optimistic. We can do it, he said, but only if nothing goes wrong. Only if none of the 10,000 things that might go wrong did not go wrong. He was definitely not feeling optimistic.
Good,
Adrian replied, sighing in resignation.
Then we're only almost definitely fucked. How tight is it?
Asket winced, and Adrian grimaced his understanding.
First human to dive into a black hole. Well, would have at least been nice to have that fucking entry in the world records. Pity no one will ever know.
You'll know, Asket replied sarcastically. I've been told that's all that matters. That got a snort of amusement from Adrian. They were probably about to die together, so why not laugh in the face of it? FTL cut out. There was a lurch as the kinetics kicked in, pushed along by over 100 machines, mines, and missiles, to give the ship drive the slight but consistent boost it needed. Asket took the initial readings on their position, aware of the fearful anticipation with which the human was waiting. Asket cleared his throat and turned to face Adrian. Well, the good news is that I planned for the tightest possible chance. Remember the red line?
Fuck.
Get buckled in, Asket suggested. It's going to get bumpy, thanks to the time dilation and gravity waves. Adrian stared at him for a moment before doing as suggested.
I'd forgotten about that. Do you know how long this trip is going to lose us?
Asket knew he'd be thinking about Jen. He'd be thinking about how she was out there somewhere, stuck on an alien world all by herself with only the ruins for company. It was probably much more pleasant than what was going on here, but Adrian wouldn't be thinking that way. I don't know how to tell you this, Asket said gravely, but at the speeds we will be going, what seems like a 10-hour trip, to us, well, everybody else you know will age an additional 15 minutes. Adrian stared at him, mouth open.
You shit! You mean it's not going to be like a fucking year or 10?
I'm not planning on taking up residence, Asket snickered. Adrian laughed, loud and long, as though he was laughing out the awfulness of their day.
You fucking well had me going for a moment there. Jesus Christ, I almost shit myself thinking about life going on everywhere else while we were stuck getting away from this fucking thing.
Adrian's laughs ran dry, and he rested back into his seat.
You know, I was thinking that apart from the dragon slaying, today was probably the worst day of my life.
My today would probably be the worst day of anyone's life, Asket argued. You defeated 2 Vulza, And you didn't get shot.
Well, the day's not over yet, Adrian replied pessimistically. What's the bet I end up getting shot now you've said that?
Askett had heard of the human fondness for gambling and considered what might be worth wagering, then shrugged. Why not bet at all? The odds were good that Adrian wouldn't live to collect. 15 million credits. Adrian blinked in a momentary confusion.
It was just a figure of... Wait, isn't that a whole fuckload?
Yes, Askett confirmed. It was probably a dozen times the yearly wage of a corporate leader, and it had been a lot easier to earn. But it doesn't count if you do it, or you have yourself shot.
Where did you get that much?
Adrian asked, annoyingly ignoring the details of the wager. Usually by hacking the accounts of most people who enjoy my delightful company, Askett told him. Altogether, I picked up close to 1 million from the officers of the Kelsey fleet alone. Adrian stared at him in complete amazement.
No shit.
Askett returned a slight, self-satisfied smile. No shit.
Wait,
Adrian frowned, shooting a very wary glare at Askett.
You haven't stolen from me, have you?
You have no money, Askett replied, rather amused, and you steal absolutely anything you want. I mean, how many ships is this now? You've even stolen a Volza, although technically I helped. It's actually so inspiring that you could almost consider my own thefts as a sort of homage. Adrian seemed put out by that, and decided to stare at his console instead.
Didn't think it was that much stealing.
He proceeded to look thoughtful, and then somewhat embarrassed and discomforted by whatever it was he'd been thinking about.
Well, maybe it has been that much stealing. I should stop stealing.
Askett thought that particular resolution would last about as long as it took Adrian to find the next shiny thing, but he kept such comments to himself. Instead, he turned on the main screen to display their heading, and the singularity itself along with it.
That's it then?
Adrian asked, staring at the screen.
I don't see it.
It's easier to see where it's bending the light. There, Askett pointed out. At his command, an overlay appeared on the display to give a better indication of distance and position. The numbers on the former were decreasing fast. Adrian must have noticed it too.
Looks like we're moving a fair clip, he noted. How fast is that exactly? Something like light speed?
More like less than 1% of it, Askett said with a snort. That's still really quick. The hull began to rattle, and they both looked around at it, waiting for the moment when the whole thing fell to pieces.
What's that?
Adrian asked, glancing at Askett. Probably debris hitting the ship, Askett replied. With luck, we'll actually last long enough to reach the black hole. That didn't seem to make Adrian feel any better, because he was gripping his seat so tightly his knuckles were white.
Is it going to be like this all the way?
Not a chance, Askett said. It's only going to get worse. 5 hours was coming up fast. And it didn't seem like Askett had been lying. The shuddering had only increased, and now its rattle had made its way down to his bones.
Gravity is getting heavy,
Adrian said, wishing he could wipe the sweat away from his brow. They'd long since donned helmets in case of sudden decompression, although they didn't bother with providing 13 with the same protection, and there were simply no options when it came to Barney the Space Dragon. Not that it mattered with 13. His body had given out under the excessive gravity about the time the sirens started nagging about hull fatigue and other nonsense warnings that only mattered to people that had some kind of a choice.
I noticed,
Askett replied weakly. Adrian didn't need to be a doctor to tell the little Cortai was suffering. He'd done an admirable job of persisting through the pain of a broken limb and cracked ribs, but those injuries would only be exacerbated by the high G-forces.
How much can the artificial gravity cope with?
Adrian asked, although what he really wanted to know was how long Askett himself could last. Adrian didn't want to get to the end of this and need to bury another friend. That kind of question wasn't fooling anyone, and Askett turned his head to look at Adrian with defiance in his eyes.
I'll survive more than this.
The ship shook violently all of a sudden, and as a new alarm began to wail, Adrian found himself nearly crushing the arms of his seat in an iron grip.
What the fuck was that?
Starboard dorsal finally came free, Asket wheezed. I'm recalculating the trajectory.
Adrian tensed for bad news.
And? Still good,
Asket replied, sounding far too tired for his own good.
Adrian, if I don't make it...
Don't talk like that, mate, Adrian interrupted sharply. You're going to be fine.
Yes, Asket agreed. But in case I'm not, I want you to know that you can't have my money. You can't have any of it.
Adrian blinked, turning his back to look at the Kortai to find him smiling weakly. He laughed. You shit stirrer. You're fine.
Just a little out of breath, Asket admitted. Aside from the arm of...
They froze at the rising creak of straining metal and slowly turned to face the starboard wall, where the noise only grew louder. Oh, Adrian whispered with a sense of dreadful anticipation. Shit. A sickening scream cut through his words as the hull ripped itself apart, a violent twisting of ship and tortured steel, pulling away at worn fastenings until they burst. The starboard side of the command deck fell away in a shower of lightning and a scream of air, spiraling into an inky oblivion that Adrian would never forget. The void took it all. The air, the crushed remains of 13, and every other scrap of shit that hadn't been tied down. It all poured out to feed the terrible blackness. The Volza scrambled, blind and confused, claws scraping uselessly along the convulsing steel deck until he too fell into emptiness, and his flailing form vanished almost instantly from Adrian's sight. Then everything was still. Never in his life had Adrian been so glad that buckles existed, and were a thing in space. It was a pity about Barney, but at least it hadn't been him. And the fact that he would no longer be able to turn up to rescue Jen while riding a dragon no longer seemed quite as important. He had a moment of senseless incomprehension as he bore witness to the great engine of uncreation, and then the awful screams began. His screams. Jesus fucking Christ! He shouted in raw terror as the abyss yawned wide to his right, a direction that now felt very much more like down. Holy fucking shitsticks!
Some of the computers are still working, Asket quickly determined,
relief in his voice along with a sense of desperation that hinted he was barely keeping it together.
We lost a big chunk of the fragmented hull there.
No fucking shit, Adrian replied, unable to keep his eyes from the terrible blackness below. He clung to his seat to prevent himself from sagging too heavily towards the doom below. He didn't want to be any closer to that fucking thing than he needed to be.
Adrian, Asket continued gravely, we don't have enough mass anymore. When we get past the singularity, we're going to have to use that final push and hope it gets us far enough.
We haven't exactly had a lot of fucking luck with hoping for shit, Adrian snapped, looking at that huge space of emptiness, and the way the light seemed to bend around it like it was passing through water. He didn't think he'd ever been as flat-out terrified. His own personal re-entry of a planet's atmosphere now seemed absurdly untroublesome, compared to what threatened him now.
Maybe our luck will change, suggested Asket.
The poor Kortai really must have been losing it at this point, because he was beginning to sound like an optimist. Adrian reflected that it could also just be profound desperation, the same sort he himself was feeling right now. There were times when they began to sound pretty much the same, and if there was ever a time for them to overlap, this would be it. How much more of this shit do we have to go? Adrian shouted, more over his own terror than any noise. Even with the chasm below, tearing much-needed pieces of the ship from them, the void held only silence, and it was an awful, deadly silence. Asket? Adrian asked, twisting his head to see the form of the Kortai hanging limp in the buckles. His eyes widened. Asket! The intense gravity had been too much for Asket, and he had blacked out shortly after the ship had fallen apart. He must have remained that way for a while, because by the time he was conscious again, the singularity was behind them, and they were pointed out into open space.
I feel like shit,
he declared as he woke. And if anything, he was underestimating the sensation. He truly could not remember a time when he had felt more drained or more injured than he did now,
and yet there was no time for any more rest.
"Askett," Adrian asked, sounding shocked, but glad at the same time. "You're alive!"
"Some might call it that," Askett replied bitterly. "People more optimistic than I am. I see we haven't lost much more of the ship."
Adrian laughed humorlessly. "Yeah, and thank fuck for that. Let's never do that again."
"Agreed," Askett said without hesitation. "But let's not forget that the day is still not over. We have that one last push."
"I started that a minute ago," Adrian said. "The last fucking kick. How are we looking?"
Askett inspected the trajectory projection, and to his surprise it was looking good, so long as the drive held out for just 1 minute longer. "Looks like we'll make it if it holds. Then we can punch back into FTL."
"Do you reckon it will?"
Adrian asked, but as far as Askett could tell, there wasn't any hope there. Nothing but the question and a deep weariness. Askett shook his head, the same weariness upon him. "I don't..." The lights all went out, with the exception of Askett's datapad that now lit his vacuum suit pocket. He took it out and read the bad news. "No." Adrian sighed heavily.
"Fuck me."
Askett sighed too. "We're not done yet, Adrian," he said, wishing with everything he had that this day would come to its end. "We have one last chance." The life pod on the command deck had been connected to the starboard hull, and it had, along with everything else, been torn away to feed the maw of the black hole. It had been the only fully functional life pod on the ship, but it hadn't been the only life pod. There was no time to be gentle now, and Adrian had tethered Askett to his back in spite of the little Kortai's curses and yelps of pain. There was no way that he could move as quickly through the microgravity as Adrian could manage, and there was no way he could negotiate the broken hallways either. Not that there was much left of any other kind. The command deck, it seemed, had barely been attached to the rest of the ship after what it had endured, and it seemed that their fortune had held at least that far. It was jutting out from its place on the ship, connected by a twisted wreckage to the larboard, and the long cables that now drifted free of any containment. Adrian had made the 200-meter, uncontrolled leap towards the next section of the ship, landing lightly on the wall of some annihilated room, and blasting straight through it to find himself in a storage room. He nearly laughed. With the exception of the big hole in the starboard side, it had the same layout as the one he and Askett had broken their way into when they had first boarded the vessel. He briefly marveled at what seemed so long ago now, despite only being a matter of hours, that it had begun to feel rather nostalgic. There wasn't much laughter to be had now, though. There wasn't time to have it, even if he could find any. The more time he spent fucking around, the less chance they would have of the life pod actually getting them out of there. "Next door," Askett said, peering from over his shoulder. "That's the cargo bay."
"I know," Adrian replied, wondering how he was going to get through it.
His anti-tank gun might have done the job, but that had been among those objects that fed the Dark Star.
"Any ideas on getting through it?"
Askett sighed. "Got a pipe?" Now Adrian did laugh, but he started looking through the boxes until he found something that helped. It wasn't a pipe, though. It was better than a pipe. He smiled in weary relief, activated the fusion cutter, and started slicing through the door like it was butter.
"Thank fuck for small mercies."
"Look for a crate big enough to hold a life pod," Askett said, and pointed over to the larboard side of the cargo bay, where the bigger crates were stored. "It's supposed to be over there, so it should still be in one piece."
"I hope we didn't blow it up with a missile earlier,"
Adrian said, looking over and seeing the mess that had started sliding across the deck under the power of the black hole's gravity. The huge starboard airlock was still in one piece, but a massive pile of debris floated around it.
"We're going to have to open that as well."
"I'll tell you what to do once we find the pod," Askett urged. "Come on." They started looking, both of them trying to make out the possible content of the crates that lined the shelves, until Askett finally happened to spy it. "There!" he cried out with certainty, jabbing a finger in the direction. "That's it!"
You're sure?"
Adrian asked, peering at the box and finding nothing remarkable about it other than its size. There's a beacon code on the side of the crate, Askett replied. Those only show up on things with beacons. Sighing, Adrian pushed them over towards it.
Here's hoping it's not a fucking satellite, then.
It wasn't, and Adrian had never been so glad to have been wrong in his life. The life pod was not, apparently, completely operational. It didn't have a functional FTL drive, for starters, and it hadn't been provisioned with food. But it had a kinetic drive, it had air, and most importantly, it had a working beacon and stasis system.
All right,
Adrian said, freeing it from the crate with a few long slashes of the fusion cutter.
What do we do now?
Now, we move it over to the door, and we feed some of its power into the thing so we can get out, Askett told him. Let me off here. I'll get over there and you can do the heavy lifting. More heavy lifting, Adrian thought with a sigh. But, of course, one way or another, there'd soon enough be nothing left to do. So he had that to look forward to.
Fine.
He was there before Askett managed to park the small capsule, near the power conduits, and had already pulled out enough slack to get the thing jump-started. Looks like you know what to do, Askett observed over the link. So do it. There's an external lead port on the side I've oriented towards you. You should be able to see it. He did see it, and Adrian didn't need any more prompting than that, and it took all of 10 seconds to fix the cables into place. It took 5 more for Askett to push enough power through the door to get it to open, or at least open enough to get the pod out. The door was massive, and their power and time were both too limited to push it all of the way. Come on, Askett demanded, as it widened enough, his voice full of urgency and fear. Get in! Get in! The pod started moving as soon as Adrian fell inside, surprised by the sudden return of artificial gravity, and he lay there to catch his breath, while Askett squeezed the pod through the narrow slot with only the gentlest of knocks and pushed it free of the dead ship. We're out, he reported, turning to look at Adrian. Now we just have to hope we did it in time.
You don't know?
Adrian asked, pulling himself to his feet for what he hoped would be the last time. The pod isn't equipped with a sophisticated navigation unit, Askett explained. I don't know anything except which direction we're going and how fast.
But are we going fast enough?
Adrian persisted, finding he was now leaning heavily on a chair for support. Askett shook his head apologetically. I just don't know.
Fuck, damn it,
Adrian cursed, hitting the chair that supported him with the last of his strength, then leaning against it all the more heavily.
What do we do now?
Now? Askett asked, turning back to look at the consoles. Well, I've already retuned the beacon to ask for help from people we want to see. So all that's left is to go into stasis. Closing his eyes, Adrian gritted his teeth and found he just didn't have the energy for it all anymore.
So, then if we don't make it...
Then we don't know, Askett finished. It sounded good. They'd either live and tell the tale, or this would be the last part of hell they'd need to go through.
All right, let's do it,
he said, holding up a fist for the little Cortai to bump.
See you on the other side, mate.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one today. I hope you enjoyed it. It's Tuesday, not Monday, obviously, but I am trying. I am getting there. Got more stuff coming up here soon, but we're nearing the end of a very hectic period, so hopefully I can get back on track. But actually, guys, I just wanted to let you know the last couple of episodes have been proofed by my wife, so if there are any mistakes, you can blame her. I'm just kidding. If she didn't, she caught them probably, but I didn't, actually fix it because I'm lazy and bad at editing. So, again, guys, thank you so much for being with me here today. I will see you all in the next one. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, evening, night, whatever it is that you've got left. And, yeah, I'll see you all back here for the next one.